My name is Daniel Hurst, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's press conference. Before we start, I'd like to ask you to make sure your phones are on silent mode. We're very lucky to be joined today by Mr. Patrick Ramage, who's the Director of Marine Conservation at the International Fund for Animal Welfare. As you would know, Japan is due to resume commercial whaling after a 30-year break. This comes about 6 months after Japan announced its withdrawal from the International Whaling Commission. Now, Mr. Ramage has had a lengthy experience in whale conservation efforts, and he'll be speaking to us to explain his view on the implications of Japan's withdrawal in a practical sense, what it actually means above the surface, on the surface, and below the surface, as he just told me. He's well acquainted with the operations of the International Whaling Commission, and we look forward to his insights about the outlook for whale conservation in the time ahead. So without further ado, I'd like to pass you over to him.
Daniel, thank you very much, and thanks to each of you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here today. I'll start with a story. 25 years ago this year, I made one of my first trips to Tokyo, and I was I was half my age then, a political staff person working with United States Senator John Kerry and Republican Congressman John Porter. And I came with a delegation of members of the U.S. Congress to an international meeting of legislators and parliamentarians held in the Japanese Diet. And this was in the context of an organization that I used to work for called GLOBE, Global Legislators for a Balanced Environment. And many of the best-known Japanese environmental leaders in the Diet at that time, Takashi Kosugi, Wakako Hironaka, Akiko Domoto, Kazuo Aichi, had invited their international counterparts from the United States, Russia, and Europe to Tokyo to discuss urgent environmental issues. And in the course of their deliberations and consideration of various issues, one of the European parliamentarians very pointedly raised the issue of Japanese whaling. And I remember my embarrassment at the rude way in which he had pounded the table and sought to impress upon his Japanese counterparts that this whaling was unacceptable and should not continue. It's ironic, but I subsequently left Washington, D.C. and joined the International Fund for Animal Welfare, an organization concerned with the protection and conservation of wild animals around the world, including whales, and have progressed in my time with the organization to become the Director of Marine Conservation, and often in the intervening years found myself in Japan, meeting with some of those same friends and colleagues as they became more senior in the Diet and then went into retirement. And we've laughed together at the irony of my initial embarrassment at the raising of the issue, and that it has been the issue over the last 25 years or so that has so regularly brought me to Japan, which I personally have rejoiced in, because over the course of doing this work and working on what can sometimes be a difficult issue between Japan and other countries, I've fallen more and more in love with Japanese culture, or at least my sense of Japanese culture. And so it's meaningful for me personally, and certainly given my professional portfolio as Director of Marine Conservation for an organization concerned with building a world in which animals and people can thrive. It's very meaningful to be with you today and to welcome what is arguably one of the most important developments in international marine conservation since the passage of the global moratorium on commercial whaling, which was imposed by the Whaling Commission in 1986. Had you told me or my colleagues toiling away in the International Whaling Commission, where IFAW is an accredited NGO observer delegation, the same status that Japan will now enjoy at the Commission, had you told me or my colleagues 5 or 10 years ago that Japan would make the decision and announce the decision on its own terms to exit Antarctic whaling, to quit whaling in the North Pacific, to overall end its high seas whaling activities, and finally to end the long-running sham of so-called scientific whaling, which has been pursued and aggressively promoted by the Japan Fisheries Agency and other apologists for whaling in Japan, that Japan would quit all that on its own without any expectation of some sort of political arrangement or quid pro quo. We would have told you to have your head examined. And yet, ladies and gentlemen, that is exactly what we are seeing. And I don't know how much to credit Prime Minister Abe, sometime Minister of Agriculture Hayashi, LDP General Secretary Nikai, Mr. Suga himself, the longtime Commissioner for Japan at the IWC, Joji Marishita, whom I've known for years and is exceedingly able. I don't know who deserves credit, but they all deserve to be commended because Japan has found a way out of high seas whaling. And they've done it in a way that is elegantly Japanese. It is a win-win solution that results in a better situation for whales, a better situation for Japan, a better situation for international marine conservation efforts, and is therefore to be welcomed. Nonetheless, you've seen governments and some NGO colleagues from different organizations worldwide express concern and even loud criticism of Japan for its apparently defiant announcement that it will resume commercial whaling, though just in its coastal waters. Coastal whaling makes even less sense than Antarctic and North Pacific whaling, and we can get into the reasons for that, but legally, scientifically, and in terms of implications for human health from the dwindling number of Japanese that are consuming whale meat, it's an even less sensible activity. Nonetheless, that is the course taken by Japan, and as part of this face-saving way out of the whaling business, it is the interim arrangement such that Japan, apparently with reduced and ultimately terminating subsidy support, will only be pursuing whaling activities in its coastal waters. Leaving a great nation leaving an international conservation convention is always of concern. But in this particular instance, the implications in the water for whales and the implications in the international community for Japan to take its rightful place as a leader in marine conservation are exceedingly positive. Shortly before coming to Tokyo, I was in Iceland. I, in fact, flew here from Reykjavik by way of London. And I was there, focused more on Icelandic whaling. And to my astonishment, with colleagues, I flew to the north of Iceland and was visiting with a friend of mine who's a well-known whale researcher in the Nordic countries, Dr. Mariana Rasmussen. And Mariana is leading a team that are studying blue whales to the north of Iceland and evaluating their response to levels of ocean noise, one of the many contemporary threats that whales face in waters around the world. And she was delighted to introduce me to two Japanese researchers, particularly Mr. Takashi Iwata from University of Tokyo, who has designed a suction cup tag that was being used for the research in Husavik in the north of Iceland. It's being affixed to these blue whales, and it monitors their every movement. It films beneath the water. It enables the study of living whales in their ocean habitat, which is increasingly the focus of 21st century science. And I found it a powerful metaphor for the transition that we are seeing. What we are seeing with Mr. Suga's announcement and with Japan's pending departure from the International Whaling Commission is the beginning of the end of Japanese whaling and the beginning of a new era where instead of being bashed around the world for whaling activities that have no place in the 21st century, Japan can be getting its rightful credit for its contributions to marine conservation as a great maritime nation. With that, I look forward to your questions and our discussion.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Before we continue, I'd like to say, sorry to say that the live stream is down. We have some technical issues, but we plan to be posting the video of today's talk on our YouTube account tomorrow. So please keep an eye out for that. Anyone with questions, please put your hands up. We'll take questions from the working press first. Over to you, and please state your name and affiliation before asking your question. Thank you.
Süddeutsche Zeitung, Christoph Neidhardt. In the IWC, there were propositions tabled several times that were actually more or less proposing to Japan what has happened now, that they should quit so-called scientific whaling and long-distance whaling and could get some kind of aboriginal deal for coastal whaling. For example, when this Argentine person was the president of the IWC, or the commissioner, why did Japan never accept this solution?
Well, I suppose it'd be speculative of me to give you the reasons, but as a longtime follower and NGO participant at the IWC, I'll share my perspective with you. And as you suggest, under the chairmanship of Mr. Makiera and a series of IWC chairmen, there were proposals for negotiated resolution of what had become a logjam, a stalemate at the International Whaling Commission. What has been clear to the International Fund for Animal Welfare for some years now is that the decision to end Japan's whaling was not going to be made on the floor of the International Whaling Commission. That body made that decision when it imposed the commercial whaling moratorium in 1986. Ironically, it did so with strong personal leadership from then U.S. President Ronald Reagan. And as a follower of Japanese politics, and I'm not sure if this comparison is made quite as often in Japan, but Shinzo Abe, the current prime minister, is often compared, I guess, by dint of his conservatism or the clarity of his vision or the successful packaging of his image. He's often compared to Ronald Reagan, at least in news analyses that one sees in the U.S. And in this instance, arguably, each has done their part in successive generations for international marine conservation. Reagan more overtly with a personal statement to the IWC urging the adoption of the commercial whaling moratorium. And Mr. Abe, as I've just alluded to, implicitly but very meaningfully in finally having the credibility and courage to end Japan's high seas whaling activities. Neither was the decision to end whaling, however much some of the governments or well-meaning whale hugger organizations might wish, the decision was not going to be made in Wellington or Canberra or Washington or London or Berlin. It was going to be made in Tokyo by Japanese decision makers for reasons that made sense to them and would be announced in terms of their choosing. So I think that the repeated resolutions from various conservation-minded countries, the so-called like-minded group at the IWC, the strong conservation majority, which continues, those proposals, in retrospect, were never going to be accepted by Japan because it was an outside effort imposed upon them. Indeed, the International Whaling Commission itself, established in 1946 in Washington and subsequently known as the Washington Convention. If you look at the photographs of the old white guys standing, signing the original documents, there is no Japanese face because Japan at the time was an occupied power. So I'm projecting here, and only Japanese decision makers and the Japanese people themselves could speak to this with genuine authority. But as a longtime observer and a longtime friend and fan of Japan, it seems to me that the Whaling Commission itself was always somewhat suspect. Unfettered access to marine resources matters a lot to you if you are a Japanese decision maker for obvious geographic and historic reasons. A compromise or consensus-based solution, in retrospect, was not going to be accepted by Japan. And breathtakingly, they have made the decision on their own without anything in return, which I think they should be commended for and should be welcomed by the international community.
Can I just follow up? Did the pressure, though, lead to some of this outcome, do you think? Even though they had to make the decision on their own terms, did that pressure have a role?
Absolutely. I think pressure from sustained pressure from conservation-minded countries over time certainly played its part. And we can, in retrospect, happily now, we have the opportunity to do that. We can try and do the post-mortem on Japan high seas whaling and determine how much weight to give the various factors. But consistent international pressure at the IWC and bilaterally, regularly from Australia, New Zealand, the United States, the Latin American countries, Europe, certainly had its part to play. There are theories as to why and how this decision was made and why now that we can get into, but I don't mean to diminish the leadership and importance of a steady conservation position and an anti-whaling position from the international community in encouraging this step, which ultimately the Japanese themselves had to make, and as of next week they're doing it.
Okay, next question. We'll start with you.
Sorry, another German asking a question. I'm Martin Friss from Wirtschaftswoche magazine in Germany. You said this is the beginning of the end of whaling in Japan. Could you elaborate on that? What is your prognosis, how this will develop? There will be 2 fleets of 5 boats each leaving on one day, the ports of Kushiro and I think Shimonoseki, I'm not sure. So what will happen in the next years with these fleets?
Since the moratorium on commercial whaling in 1986, Japan has killed about 23,000 whales that it's reported to the International Whaling Commission.
23,000?
23,000. They did that initially for the first several years. They did it under objection, what's called objection to the decision by the IWC, the commercial whaling moratorium, but then withdrew their objection and began to exploit a loophole in the convention under Article 8, which provides that any nation can essentially self-allocate a quota of whales to be killed for scientific research purposes. And while, again, as a friend and fan of Japan, I think it was beneath the dignity of so great a nation to do it. They claimed that the whales that they were killing every year, same boats, same companies involved, same species of whale, same fish markets where the product of this research was being sold, or at least marketed, sold less and less over time. Only after the decision to go scientific whaling, it was called science instead of overt commercial whaling. As I've alluded to, Japan on its own is ending its Antarctic whaling, ending its high seas whaling in the North Pacific, and its announced intention is to focus just on whales in its coastal waters. 3 or 4 species of whale will apparently make up the target list. One is minke whale, the smallest of the great whale species and the recent focus of the Antarctic hunt. Second, sei whale, a species that had been killed under a scientific whaling program in the North Pacific. Japan had been criticized internationally and was coming under increasing pressure from a variety of conventions, including the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, to end that whaling because it was illegally introducing product from the sea and didn't have the appropriate reservations under the CITES Convention. And then Brutus whales, a deep diving whale, less known to many, is also apparently on the target list. We don't have an exact number, but informed speculation suggests that the number will be fewer than the 333 minke whales that Japan was taking in the Antarctic. So just in terms of the body count, whales are going to do significantly better under the new commercial whaling program. You've seen media reports, I'm sure, both domestic and international, featuring interviews with folks involved in coastal whaling, expressing their concern that the market is not sufficient, that they can't continue without subsidies, that an era is ending. Ultimately, as a practical matter, it will be for Japanese decision makers, Japanese whalers, and the Japanese people to determine how long they continue whaling in their coastal waters, in contrast to some of the arguments that one sees from FCCJ. I understand there are arguments at the FCCJ, but they have nothing to do with whaling, more to do with the food in the dining room, I think. But the argument sometimes advanced by the Japan Fisheries Agency is that now that they are out of the Whaling Commission, it's open season on coastal whales. And I think that the message of the international community and legal scholars on this is not so fast. While they might wish to shed their obligations internationally upon departure from the IWC, Japan remains bound as a party, and it's commendable. My own country is not yet a party, inexplicably, to UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and as a member state of the United Nations and a participant in a variety of different conservation conventions. Japan's obligations continue irrespective of its status at the IWC. There is a duty to cooperate. There's a functional responsibility for continued participation in some form at the IWC and compliance with its regulations and procedures, because it is the preeminent and recognized body responsible for the conservation of our planet's great whale stocks and the orderly management of the whaling industry. That was the twofold mandate upon its establishing in 1946. So it's difficult, and I've thought about this a lot. For many years it was a fantasy, and now the fantasy is coming true. Japan is quitting high seas whaling, and net, one is forced to conclude that while not yet a full stop, that is a huge step toward the end of the killing of whales for their meat and other products.
Next question. Anyone else has a question, please put up your hand. Okay, Mary, go ahead.
I'm so sorry, Mary Corbett, Crestner Media, and I came very late today, so very sorry if this has already been covered, but I was wondering if you have some grasp of the commercial value, why this is being pursued by the government when it seems completely disproportionate to the demand for whale meat here. And of course, one of the accusations has been that you can't see in one place within the government budget. So where do the employees of IWC or the representatives of the commission now go? Where are they shifted to, and how is the budget allocated? And of course, there are a lot of, there have been multiple commercial subsidies. For example, many large freezer warehouses in coastal towns being built for the specific purpose, but that's not in the whaling budget to begin with. It's dispersed, so I was wondering if you have some sense of why Japan is fighting so hard for these rights.
Thank you, Mary. Yes, in 2012, and for a couple of years leading up to that, the International Fund for Animal Welfare released an economic analysis of Japanese whaling. I believe it's available on the IFAW website. I can make it available to you if still relevant. But we took a hard look at this. We worked with consultants from Ernst & Young Tokyo to do that. As you say, Mary, the numbers are opaque. It reminds me of the distinction drawn in his epic work, The Enigma of Japanese Power, from Carl von Wolfram, a past president of FCCJ, where he had a lovely meditation on the distinction of the sort of tatamai honne distinction in Japanese society, and that which is to be observed above the surface and that which is actually going on. There's a metaphor there in terms of Japan's recent move and the defiance versus the actual withdrawal from whaling, but certainly deeply buried in the Japanese government's budget were all manner of direct and indirect subsidy supports for what is clearly a losing economic enterprise. And that is the conclusion that is being come to here in Japan, in Iceland, where it appears that there may be actually 0 whales caught this whaling season, this summer season in the Northern Hemisphere. And even in Norway, which suddenly is becoming the world's leading whaling nation, but the freezers that you mentioned, in order to stockpile the fat and blubber that's not being consumed any longer by the citizens of those 3 nations, that alone is an extortionate sum of money. What we were able to demonstrate using various ministries' own number, and the Ministry of Agriculture's own numbers, was that whaling had for years been an economic loser, that all manner of subsidy supports had been diverted to it, including some aid after the horrible tragedy of 3/11, after the earthquake. There had been government subsidies and Japanese taxpayer money, perhaps even international assistance, diverted to prop up this failing industry. And despite all that, the Japanese people have shown that they have no yen for whale meat, even as billions of taxpayer yen have been paid to try and keep this industry on life support. That may have played a role in this very welcome decision. The actual numbers are difficult to calculate, but we did show that Antarctic whaling in particular and the North Pacific whaling were being operated at a loss according to just the numbers that we could find in the Japanese government budget. I should add that I mentioned Ernst & Young earlier, and it was a public affairs affiliate of Ernst & Young called Shin Nihon Public Affairs that assisted with some of that analysis. And understandably, Ernst & Young at the time did not see fit to affix their corporate imprimatur to those results. It's an IFAW report first and foremost, and I'm happy to provide it afterward.
Thank you. Next question. Anyone has a question, please put up your hand. Go ahead. Others can think about questions while he's asking.
I have many questions.
Diese Deutschen, these Germans.
Morishita was president or commissioner of the IWC just before Japan withdrew. Do you see a connection? That was Morishita's position as commissioner, Japan's last attempt to stay within the whaling commission. And the other, I don't remember Morishita's successor's name at the fisheries agencies. I'm sure you know his name. He has been here, I think, a year or 2 ago, and insisted that commercial whaling should be should become viable if it turns into coastal whaling. And of course, he knows the same numbers as you. And he hints at Norway, where those few whalers that are active are actually commercially viable, or they say so. Why is he wrong?
When I was first invited by FCCJ, Ito-san from the club was in touch with me about members' interest in having an NGO perspective on these developments, these IWC developments. And I immediately accepted, of course, and was excited about it. And Ito-san subsequently emailed and said, would I have any objection if there were a double header? And Hideki Moronuki, Joji's successor as whaling commissioner for Japan, would participate at the same time. And I said I would be honored and delighted. Subsequently, Ito-san again emailed last month and said, unfortunately, Moronuki-san will be out of the country and unable to participate. But he suggests Morishita. This gave me pause. I was still honored, and I guess delighted, but also intimidated, because I have come to admire Joji Morishita as an exceedingly able whaling commissioner, chair of the commission, and diplomat for Japan. I used to say, in a slightly nasty way, to press at the IWC that while JFA was a second-rate agency, Joji Morishita was a first-rate representative for Japan. And he did a master class in how to lead the commission through difficult discussions at the most recent meeting of the IWC in Brazil in September of last year. To the extent that I greeted him in the lobby on the final day, everyone was exhausted after several days of meetings. It had been very contentious because whether Honne or Tatamai, the Japan delegation, had presented audacious proposals for overturning the moratorium and resuming full-scale industrial commercial whaling and the international trade in whale meat. In retrospect, that may have been posturing, but that's for Japan decision makers to know and sort out. But I greeted and congratulated Joji, whom I had come to know over many years, and to his surprise and mine, I was very emotional. And I said, that was masterful. You really showed how, in an even-handed way, to lead the commission through these difficult waters. And your genuine caring about the commission and the international community grappling with these issues was very apparent. I've had less opportunity to interact directly with Moronuki-san, and am therefore less impressed. I'm particularly unimpressed with his characterization of whaling, whether in Iceland, Norway, or Japan, as a commercially viable enterprise. As recently as the Monday story where Elaine Lees of Reuters quoted Morishita-san, you can see he's somewhat more circumspect and says, well, now we will see whether this is a commercially viable enterprise. Whaling, whether that's economically viable, and whether the marketing of whale meat is economically viable. And he's right. We will see. But I spend a lot of time in Japan, Iceland, and Norway, not just because they're wonderful countries to visit, because they are, but because it's our learning as an organization at IFAW that that's where the decision will be made to end whaling. All three countries are coming to that conclusion. Optimistic promotion of the whaling industry by Hideki Moronuki notwithstanding.
Next question. Go ahead, Catherine.
Hi, Catherine Wortley, freelance. Thank you for your presentation. So recently, in the past months and years, we've seen a rise in demand for whale watching. So I'm wondering if that reflects a a growing anti-whaling sentiment among the Japanese population, because of course more and more of them want to go and watch whales along Japan's coast. And the second part of the question is, what impact, if any, would the commercial whaling on the coastal waters affect these whale watching programs that are important to local economies there? Thank you.
Catherine, thank you. I'm very pleased that you raised that question, and I'll plead jet lag. It was supposed to be an important part of my opening remarks because it is very striking. The slow but steady growth of whale and dolphin watching in Japan. And we know this at IFAW because we've undertaken over the last 20 years 2 global economic analyses of the economic impact of the whale watching industry. A fast-growing form of ecotourism, which now occurs in 118 countries and territories worldwide. This is a more than $2 billion, not yen, $2 billion industry that is delivering economic returns on a widespread basis to coastal communities around the world and here in Japan. From Hokkaido in the north to Okinawa, Zamami, Ogasawara in the south. Japanese operators, 150 of them now, are providing this powerful experience to mostly Japanese citizens. I think north of 80% of participants in whale watching are Japanese, but also increasingly, particularly in Ogasawara and Zamami Island, other parts of Okinawa, are providing this experience and profiting from doing it, as opposed to the very narrow economic benefit, mostly through subsidies, that's achieved by the whaling industry, which the numbers I've seen are something like 300 employees, many part-time, some full-time, I imagine, associated with whaling historically. So, yes, the enthusiasm of Japanese and citizens of other nations worldwide is palpable. The development of the industry is dramatic. In 2014, a coalition of Japanese whale watch operators was formed here in Tokyo called the Japan Whale and Dolphin Watching Council, JWDC, I think. Prudently, they have regularly rejected grant support from the International Fund for Animal Welfare and other NGOs. We have assisted, particularly after the tragedy of 3/11, we've assisted some operators on a practical level, repairing their vessel, or with some of their marketing activities on a location-by-location basis. But this utterly Japanese coalition of operators represent stakeholders who now have a voice, as you suggest, in coastal communities. And while Antarctic and North Pacific whaling ostensibly don't conflict on a physical basis, high seas whaling pose less of a stark conflict with watching whales on the coast. Coastal whaling threatens to literally kill the geese that lay the golden eggs, to and thereby put in direct competition a modern form of economic activity, a more sustainable use of whales, if you like, versus an outmoded, historically significant, historically, culturally, and economically important, but now outmoded activity that has no place in the 21st century. It will be up to the operators and the enthusiasts for whale and dolphin watching in Japan how vocal they are about this nonsensical activity. But it clearly, the announcement that Japan will now open commercial whaling and be launching fleets on the 1st of July from Chiba, from Taiji and other places, puts Japanese whalers on a collision course with their own country's economic interests and with committed business people in coastal communities who are benefiting from this new relationship with whales.
Thank you. Next question. Go ahead.
I'm an associate member, if you may allow me.
Yes, I'll let, if nobody else has a question, please go ahead.
My name is Kurt Sieber, an associate member. When Mr. Morishita was here about 2 years ago, I think, I was asking him the question when the feasibility of really running a profitable whaling operation. I asked him, what is the average consumption of Japanese population? And this is actually a very easy calculation. You have about 5,000 tons of whale meat in this market. By the way, Iceland is still exporting. Last year, I think it was 1,500 tons exported from Iceland to Japan. So 5,000 divided by 125 million is 40 grams per year per person. And it's obvious that this can never work. But, well, let's see what is coming out. This is more a comment than a question. I have another one. I'm very heavily involved in the whale watching business in Hawaii. Not only whales, but dolphins as well, because dolphin is all the year round, whereas whales is only from December to April or so. So actually my 80th birthday last year, we chartered a big ship for the whole family and friends and so on for just dolphin watching. It was in July. Unfortunately, it didn't work. And the $2 billion which you mentioned is totally correct. I mean, and of course, it's not only the whaling industry itself in Hawaii, and particularly Maui.
Whale watching, right.
It's the condos and the hotels and so, which made a fantastic business opportunity for the whole island. So thank you so much for presenting this today in a very positive light also for Japan. There is going to be some tatemai and some honne, but the general direction is definitely correct, and we are all very appreciating your personal efforts in this direction. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for your comments, and banzai on your 80th birthday. You're startlingly well preserved. What you say is correct in terms of the steadily dwindling consumption of whale meat in Japan. I've seen reference to it now occupying some 0.1% of the consumption of meat in Japan, and estimates of 40 to 50 grams, kind of the size of half a medium-sized apple, is the total per capita consumption. One often hears at the Whaling Commission and in the media discussion of food culture and the importance of Japanese food culture. And as a lover of Japanese foods, including sushi, I can attest to the importance of respect for culture generally and for food culture. But I come from a nation where whaling was much more central in the era of Yankee whaling to the culture and economy of my country than it ever has been in Japan, Iceland, or Norway. I say that admiringly, not critically. The criticism for the devastation of many whale populations in close to 2 centuries of commercial whaling, the blame for that lies not with Japan or even Iceland and Norway. It lies with the United States, European countries, Australia, New Zealand. All of those countries have over time reconciled themselves to the emerging consensus for whale conservation instead of whale killing in the 21st century. A Japanese metaphor, if you'll allow me. My awareness of Japan began with my dad many years ago. I had a childhood fascination with this country. And in the 1970s, my father read a book by Abe Kobo, a Japanese novelist. And the title of the book intrigued me even when I was in 3rd or 4th grade. It was The Boxman. And in this short novel by Kobo Abe, the protagonist decides, he lives in downtown Tokyo, he decides to divorce himself from his family and society and retreat to the streets of Tokyo and live inside a cardboard box. And it was a powerfully effective novel, as several of Abe's are. And in this decision, while wrapped in defiance, while ticking certain boxes for domestic constituencies and for face-saving for a proud nation internationally, Japan has found its way out of the box of the whaling problem and the confines of the stalemate at the IWC. I would go so far as to say that this move helps put the IWC on a clearer course for whale conservation. And ironically, we have Japanese decision makers to thank for that, because the logjam, the stalemate, the initially annual and now every 2 years Donnybrooks, where delegations and NGOs would come to the IWC meeting each year and strap on their helmets and their armor and come out swinging and defend their diametrically opposed positions. Thanks to this announcement by Japanese decision makers, there is clear water for the IWC to continue to accelerate its migration into being the preeminent whale conservation body of the IWC, the commission itself and its scientific committee. So the ripple effects and positive implications for whales, for Japan, for international marine conservation efforts are tremendous.
I'd actually like to draw you out on that. Is it what exactly will the IWC focus on now, do you expect, with Japan out of it? And Japan said it'll be an observer. Do you see any, even though they won't be bound by the decisions, do you see any effect in norms or anything that might flow from whatever decisions the IWC takes now?
It'll be fascinating to watch that unfold. I think if you look, and part of the reason for the Japanese Fisheries Agency and Ministry of Agriculture, to the extent that it cares about this minuscule issue, the source of their frustration at the IWC was very real. Japan was regularly bringing proposals that were soundly rejected by the international community. And JFA delegates and members of the Japanese Diet, including most recently in Brazil last autumn, would loudly complain about the international community being out of step with the true mandate of the Commission. It becomes clear, and I think even the decision makers that have announced this recent action in Japan themselves have quietly come to the conclusion that it wasn't the IWC or the conservation majority internationally that was out of step. It was the positions as being championed by JFA and the Institute for Cetacean Research, which seems to be a sort of retirement sinecure for longtime apologists for whaling. And the IWC, from the imposition of the whaling moratorium, the elaboration of the Southern Ocean Whale Sanctuary around Antarctica in 1994, on a vote of 23-1, no prize for guessing which lone nation voted against the Southern Ocean Whale Sanctuary, through the creation of a conservation committee in 2003 at the meeting in Berlin, an initiative proposed and championed by Mexico, and sometime Commissioner Andres Rosenthal there. A meeting in Jersey in, I believe, 2009 or 2010, where a financial cleanup initiative championed by the then chair of the Finance and Administration Committee from Australia and the UK government was adopted because the Commission was awash in brown paper bags full of cash, to the extent that the executive leadership of the staff of the Whaling Commission had expressed concern that there was a security risk to bureaucrats that were staffing the IWC because they were having to travel to back from international meetings laden with cash that certain countries were using on the spot to pay for their dues. So the left to its own devices, without Japan being able to stymie the dialogue at the IWC and sitting with the rest of us as an observer to the proceedings, there's every prospect that we'll see an acceleration in the conservation agenda, focused more and more, not on whaling, which is no longer the conservation threat to the great whales. Entanglement in fishing gear, pollution of marine habitats, new and emerging threats that we're only beginning to understand, like ocean noise, and our understanding is improved by the efforts of Takashi Iwata and other Japanese researchers that are facilitating an understanding in the international community of that threat and measures that can be taken to mitigate against it. Ship strikes, collisions with high-speed vessels, which sometimes are crossing important breeding and feeding areas for whales and high concentrations of whales and killing them or cutting them up as a result. Those will increasingly be the issues. Already they are the concerns that the IWC spends most of its time on, and I think that focus will continue. The IWC is migrating from becoming a whalers club to a whale conservation body. And Japan's recognition of that is part of what led them to exit. By their exit, they are facilitating and accelerating that transition. Perhaps that's enough on that question.
We probably have time for one final question. So I'm going to give preference to someone who hasn't asked a question, so please go ahead.
I'm Mariam Gucci with the AP. Sorry, I was late at the beginning, and I might have missed some of your presentation that may be in my question. But I'm wondering what you think would happen within the next few years after Japan starts commercial whaling in terms of economy and its influence on the local economy, and also its impact on local fishing industry. And also, I thought that what you talked about, its commercial whaling starting in relation to the whale watching industry was very interesting. So I would like to see how you think would work out over the next few years or in the future in this region. Thank you.
A dear friend of mine and a longtime whale biologist working with the International Fund for Animal Welfare, Mr. Vasily Papastavrou, once said to media, and I was so envious because I'm so proud of my sound bites sometimes, but he said that animals, people, and coastal communities all do better when whales are seen and not hurt. And I think that very aptly summarizes the situation, Mari, that we expect to see unfold now. When forced to sink or swim on its economic merits, this industry will drown very quickly. And that won't be because some whale hugger from far away has come over and made a pronouncement. That conclusion is, to the extent that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, the decision that the Japanese people have made about whaling seems to be clear. We've done polling in this country, working with Nihon Research Agency over a number of years. And what is striking to me is not that the Japanese people are pro-whaling, and they're not anti-whaling when you ask questions in a poll. They are anti-whaling. Because while there are so many stark differences, Japanese people, like people in many countries, don't much appreciate when foreigners come over and tell them what to do. And but now, as your question implies, whaling will be forced to make it or not on its merits, on the benefits that it delivers to coastal communities, on the enthusiasm of Japanese people for maintaining a steady flow of whale meat and its availability for their consumption. And Japanese in whaling areas that I've met with personally, which was a great privilege for me, and media articles that I've read, repeatedly suggest to me that among those who are actually consuming whale meat, the overwhelming majority are older Japanese with a sort of nostalgic connection, who remember eating the whale meat in their school lunch programs. And again, there are stark differences between Japan and my country and other nations, but we seem to have a strong connection in that most of us don't remember our school lunches with tremendous enthusiasm. And so I think that the writing is on the wall. In the words of the US politician Adlai Stevenson, humans are unique animals. We only read the writing on the wall when our back is to it. And ultimately, JFA and the government of Japan did read the writing on the wall, and for reasons that ultimately are known perhaps only to them, have made a very wise decision that has tremendous benefits for whale conservation worldwide. Yes, it's wrapped in defiance. It is put in terms that are face-saving, but the real impact in the water of this fresh thinking and bold action by Shinzo Abe and his government are undeniable. And it's not for me to pronounce what the future of Japan's coastal whaling will be. But I would not bet a lot of money on its survival, and apparently neither will the government of Japan, and I commend them for that decision.
Well, that seems like a good...
Just for the question you said,
very quickly.
The industry is drowning quickly. Can you give a time frame?
Just for the recording, the question was that you said the industry is drowning quickly. Can you give a time frame?
I'm going to resist on that and stand by my deference to the decision-making authority ultimately of the Japanese consumer for how quickly the death watch will conclude. But what we are seeing is the beginning of the end of Japanese whaling. I said at a press conference around our 2012 economic analysis, which I mentioned earlier and I'm happy to provide, I said on a panel moderated by David McNeil on that occasion that I felt, this was in 2012, that I felt that progress on the whaling issue in Japan required more low bows and fewer low blows. That hasn't always been the case at the IWC. I'm embarrassed to say, with some of the statements that I've made to media over the years, I'm not sure have always lived up to that standard, but I do respect and admire the clear decision that Shinzo Abe and his government have made on this one, and hope that whale conservation groups worldwide and the many fine organizations that have worked on this issue for many years will see beneath the surface and correctly assess this historic marine conservation milestone.
Patrick Ramage, thank you very much for speaking with us today. As a thank you, we'd like to present you with 1 year's honorary membership at the FCCJ, and we'd invite you to come and come back to the club and enjoy the fine food that's available in the main bar, as referred to earlier. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for participating. Thank you.